Second idea that I think is crucial for dialogue is that real dialogue recognizes and responds to power differentials. Just as we live in a world of multiplicity, we live in a world of inequity, hegemony, and inequality. We live in a world of oppression. The overall employment rate in the United States is currently 9.7%, and we are told declining. The unemployment rate among Latinos is 12.4% and rising. The unemployment rate for African Americans is 16% and rising. We live in a world of inequity. Consider health insurance. The Obama administration and the Democrats state that the number of people without health insurance in the United States ranges between 40 million and 46 million people. The Pacific Research Institute, a conservative think tank, is floating a much lower number, as if it's any better. 8 million, only 8 million. Even one American without health care, health coverage, and health insurance is one too many. We live in a country of inequity. In the vast majority of the United States and the nations of the world, same-sex marriage is illegal. We feel good about ourselves in Massachusetts, but we are in the minority. We're an anomaly. We live in a world of inequity and inequality. We cannot then engage in dialogue without paying attention to power differentials. We cannot conceive or imagine that everyone who walks into a dialogue room is peer to each other. Individuals and groups do not sit down as equals. They sit down to dialogue as unequals with all of the risks that entails. Mikhail Bakhtin, the 20th century Russian philosopher, writes that power is essential to a full understanding of dialogue. Reminding us of the power relationships between dialogue participants, Bakhtin recognized that the language used in dialogue and the languages used are tied to beliefs and ideology, and that the language and the use of language differs depending on social class. To describe the power relations that are embodied in language, Bakhtin used the term heteroglossia. He defined that as competing languages and discourses, the dialogically interrelated speech practices operative in a given society at a given moment, wherein the idioms of different classes, different races, genders, generations, and locales compete for ascendancy. In other words, not only do different groups speak in different languages, but they also compete to define the terms of dialogue. Bakhtin distinguishes the language of the dominant classes who have the sole right to define meaning from the language of the oppressed of the world who wish to appropriate language for the purpose of liberation. Consider the word safety that often comes up in dialogues. Reflect on your own experience about what individuals, what groups, and what interests advance the concern and express the need for safety. Consider in the dialogues that you facilitate who is in the room. What language groups, what social class groups, what racial groups, what gender groups, and so on. And how much airspace do these various groups and people take up? What does that have to do with their personality, and what does it have to do with their status? Consider another example from my own life. Last year, I began teaching at a freestanding institution of higher learning in Boston. This is after 30 years of teaching, having been a tenured professor at Hampshire College and a visiting associate professor at Mount Holyoke for the last 10 years. So I began teaching in this institution, one of those institutions with one-year contracts and no tenure. It was the first year of a brand new program. There were 4 faculty members. Except for me, they were all white, all from the Boston area, all Irish American, and all colleagues and friends with a long history of relationship. In October, I asked an impolitic question. The question I asked was why the women in this 4-person faculty changed their mind when the only man on the faculty entered the conversation. That was a landmark moment for me. After that, in October, in a semester that lasted through June, I was immediately outside the loop. All faculty meetings and program planning ended, as far as I knew. They took place without me. My request for a faculty dialogue, let's sit down and talk about this, went unanswered, and by the end of the year, and despite outstanding evaluations by my students, I was not invited back. To understand power dynamics, dialogue folks must pay attention to what dialogues cannot take place. Because those who are in power will not allow certain dialogues to take place. Let us also remember that power itself doesn't exist in dualities. It is not a have it all or have none kind of entity. Nothing disturbs me more than characterizing targeted groups as powerless. Power is the ability to do or to act, the capability of doing or accomplishing something. No one is powerless. No group is powerless. And to suggest that this is true, I believe, is an act of disempowerment. Examples: blacks in the segregated South fought for freedom. Women who could not vote, divorce, or bear children according to their own timetable. All of these groups were trapped by bias, discrimination, privilege of others. Their actions after that show that they were not powerless. Their victories render the assertion of powerlessness null and void. Indeed, power is not one thing. There are many kinds and many levels of power. Organizational theorists study position power, referent power, reward power, coercive power. Power is not one all or nothing encompassing entity. In our dialogue work, we must look at the power of the privileged, unearth it, examine it, and sometimes work to dismantle it. But we must also look at the power of the oppressed, name it, highlight it, build it, reinforce it. This too levels the playing field. With us tonight, we have a group of people who are intergroup dialogue educators. And when it comes to, and my friends sitting up in the front row, and when it comes to thinking about power, the intergroup dialogue educators really are in the lead. And I want to highlight my friend and colleague, Jimena Zuniga, would you raise your hand, who's one of the outstanding dialogue researchers in the United States. They recognize power, privilege, historical and institutional oppression that is endemic to dialogue. To ignore power dynamics in the construction and facilitation of dialogues ultimately sabotages the goal of getting to we.